Well, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to Tools for Community Engagement, Part 2, Forums and Asset Mapping. This is the last in our four-part series on broadband planning, data and community engagement. I'm Chris Stark, Digital Equity Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin Extension, and I will serve as your facilitator for today's session. My colleague, Jessica Beckendorf, Community Development Outreach Specialist, will be working behind the scenes to ensure our session runs smoothly and will also be presenting today. I'll do my best to monitor the waiting room and questions through the chat. Today's session is co-sponsored by the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension's Organizational and Leadership Development Program, and Extension's Community Economic Development Program. Let's do a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's meeting is being recorded, and the final video, along with a PowerPoint from today's session, will be posted on the Extension Community Economic Development website. We will provide you with a link to access the video and worksheets as soon as they are available. As a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphones when not speaking. During our session, we will offer 30 minutes of content followed by an open question and answer period. This will probably today, by the way, be 45 minutes of content, a little bit longer here. So during the question and answer, we will welcome any questions on today's topic or any broadband planning questions you may have. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop your questions or comments in the chat, and I will come back to them in the second half of the hour in the last 15 minutes. We'll do the best we can on that. I'm fortunate to have with me today my colleagues Jessica Beckendorf and Josset Gawley as presenters. Jessica is a community development outreach specialist who has more than 20 years of experience with public engagement processes. Josset is a program development and evaluation specialist and uses an asset-based approach to his work as an educator. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jessica.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm really happy to be here today. I love talking about community engagement. So today we're going to be introducing two more tools that you might consider implementing as part of your community engagement efforts: community forums and asset mapping. So using community engagement tools like forums and asset mapping help us to better plan toward Internet for All. And this is something that if you've been to our previous workshops, you would have heard us talking about. But just as a reminder, Internet for All in Wisconsin means that all Wisconsinites have access to affordable broadband service and equitably share in the benefits of broadband technology. Our mission is to make high-speed internet available and affordable for all Wisconsinites. So learning as much as we can from the people who live in the communities we serve will help us make this possible. Community forums can be a really effective tool for gathering input about the community, about their needs and issues around broadband. It can also help you promote any surveys that you might be launching or that you might have already launched. It can help lead into asset mapping, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And it can help create awareness of the issue. The forums are also a chance for you to generate enthusiasm for broadband expansion. They can be a really great way to create awareness, like I said, and to educate the community members on how many different ways that the internet can help build quality of life. Right. And so and the ways that we can build quality of life are actually available to them right now, or at least to communities that have affordable and reliable internet service. So if you don't have affordable, reliable internet service, they may not know what all the different ways that all the different things that are available to them. So the most important part of these forums, though, is hearing from the people who attend them. You might already have a vision, for example, that your planning team has been operating under. But these forums are actually also a way for the community to help co-create that vision with you, to help you see where you may need to modify or amend your vision. Being open to changing direction and to incorporating the things that you hear from these forums can help build the desire within the community to make the vision a reality. This will help set the stage for things like asset mapping or surveys. So besides the information that your team will get from hearing from community members, forums also give opportunity for all community members to express their opinions and to be heard. So even if that opinion is negative or skeptical of the potential of broadband to enhance the quality of life, they still get that opportunity to share with you what their concerns are. And you have then the opportunity to respond to that and to maybe even incorporate their concerns into your own planning efforts. The opportunity to have these open discussions makes the work of your team or your committee transparent, and it lets everyone know that their opinion matters. In other words, forums can provide an opportunity to build trust within the community. One of the reasons that it's so important for you to carefully consider who you reach out to when you're planning forums. We have a worksheet that we've shared a couple of times during these workshops that can help you think through this. I'll link to that worksheet in just a few minutes. Okay, so some tips on planning community forums. One of the things I would say is to try to plan for multiple forums if you're going to do forums, but you don't have to do that. You can have just one or two. But holding multiple forums, the benefit of that is that it helps you reach multiple audiences and it helps you raise awareness a little more widely about the positive changes that you're seeking to make through broadband expansion. You can hold as many forums as you need in order to address all of the audiences or neighborhoods or rural and urban areas as necessary, depending on your community's needs and the geography and the populations that live within your community. Another thing, when it comes to different settings and different focuses, you might want to take into consideration how certain group events may be better suited for a community forum that covers a specific topic. So for example, a school board or a PTA meeting might be really well suited for the topic of broadband benefits for education. Remember that part of your goal in hosting these forums is to share the possibilities of broadband among these community groups. So when it comes to presenting possibilities that come from the use of broadband, just keep in mind that not everyone knows what they can use the internet for. If part of your goal is to generate enthusiasm for the work your planning team is doing for broadband expansion, then a little awareness building during these forums can go a really long way. You can use these forums to challenge folks to think about the benefits that could result from greater use of the internet. For example, in other words, you can help people become more aware of how these internet-based technologies can make the community more informed, more prosperous, healthier, improve the quality of life for all. Depending on what group you're talking to, you might pick a different topic there. And then part of holding forums in different settings with different focuses might be deciding whether you will choose to focus on a specific audience or general audiences. Whatever you choose should reflect the audiences you most need to hear from and those who are typically underrepresented in civic engagement efforts. So I want to repeat that really quick because I'm going to ask you a question related to this. Whether you choose to focus on very specific audiences for forums or general audiences, or really for any of your outreach efforts, it should reflect the audiences you most need to hear from and those who are typically underrepresented in civic engagement efforts. So really quick, I just want to put the question out to you. Thinking about your own community, which community voices would you most benefit from hearing from during a community forum? And you can put your answers in the chat. Just looking for a few thoughts on that. Rural, yeah. I was just going to say, as I was waiting for stuff to start coming in, when I was working on broadband expansion in a county, rural was definitely well, we're a rural county, but also we were looking to some of those further out, further areas, the most rural areas in the county to reach out to. And then I see immigrants and ESL speakers. Yes, absolutely. Rural residents and second homeowners around the lakes. Yes, those reaching out to those second homeowners can be really difficult. Retired people, yes. Yeah. So ag, telehealth veterans, exactly. And I think one of the great guidelines that we can use is taking a look at those covered populations that have been identified. That can give you a really great clue as to what types of specific audiences you might reach out to. Students, yeah, thank you, Todd. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one because the next one's all about planning community forums. Okay. So, oops, it didn't move on, did it? There we go. Now we're talking about planning community forums. Okay, so planning community forums. This is like a super high level process. Community forums are not difficult events to plan. Community forums, though, do require some forethought. It's not just a meeting that you put out there publicly and say, hey, everyone come to this meeting. There's a little bit of planning that does go into it. So first of all, as we just talked about briefly, identify some audiences. They can be specific, or you could hold a general community forum as well. Who do you need to hear from? And consider whose voices are often underrepresented. Ideally, then you might try to work with those audiences. If you did choose some specific audiences, you may choose to work with those audiences to plan the logistics of the meeting. There's some really great benefits to doing that. They can help you organize it. They can help provide a space possibly and a time. Maybe it's a space and time that their group typically meets. And they can assist in publicizing the event among the audience that you are trying to reach. So some ideas for this, some appropriate venues might be things like civic clubs, like Rotary or Lions, Chamber of Commerce meetings, VFW or American Legion, or maybe a special time, either preceding or following a scheduled public meeting, like school boards, city council meetings, or even meetings that are organized by churches. So churches are a great way to reach people. Deciding how you'll capture input. This is some of the forethought that you need in this is partly for, yes, it's partly for deciding what materials you need, but also it's about thinking through ahead of time how you're going to use the information. So for example, when it comes to materials, are you going to be using flip charts, Post-it notes, or note takers? And if you're using Post-it notes, how are you going to process that information when you get it in? You don't have to have all of the details in place, but you do need to have an idea of how you're going to process that information. And know how you're going to capture it and how you'll process it and how these ideas will appear in your plan. Will you narrow it down to themes and create goals for each theme? So there's really a lot of different ways that you can process this information, but my biggest recommendation here is to make sure that you understand how this information might show up in your plan and how you're going to represent it. Because the one thing you don't want to do, the thing that will break trust with the community, is asking them for their information and their opinions, and then not doing anything with it, or not really hearing what they had to say. So identify broadband topics for each forum. This is just another reminder that you might want to tailor the topics for the different audiences, like that example I gave earlier, that a school board you might not have them talk about internet in general. You might want to have them talk about specifically e-learning or topics like that. And then making your meetings accessible. I highly recommend that you offer accommodations. Someone mentioned that an audience that they needed to reach was folks who were immigrants and ESL speakers. So offer accommodations for the type of audience that you're attracting, but offer accommodations in general. Make sure that they know and that it's prominently displayed how they can request those accommodations, and be prepared if you're reaching out to an audience like the immigrants and ESL speakers, like someone put in the chat. Then make sure that you've got those accommodations ready to go, and that people maybe don't necessarily have to look for them. And I think one of the things I've seen time and time again is that the buildings are sometimes that these meetings are held in are sometimes just not accessible for people with different disabilities. And so maybe trying to make sure that those venues are accessible. And then lastly, things like time of day can be really important. And I'm sure many of you are already very experienced with that, but also it is really hard to find a time of day that works for everyone. But do your best to find the time of day that would work for the audiences you're reaching out to. Okay. And then finally, revisit your vision and goals. When the forums are done and you've reviewed the feedback, revisit your vision and goals and modify them based on what you've learned from the community. I've actually created a checklist for planning community forums that you can access now, and I'll share the link in a couple of minutes. Again, community forums are an excellent way to get community input. So we're going to actually be building out some more material in our upcoming broadband toolkit. But for today, you'll have the checklist for planning the community forums, and we'll also provide this video and these slides after the session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josset to talk about asset mapping.
Thank you, Jessica and Chris, and thank you for inviting me today. I love talking asset mapping. It's one of my go-to kind of approaches for data collection that's going to be used for planning purposes and for addressing critical community issues. Asset mapping is, I like to think of it more as an approach to data collection than a method in and of itself. In other words, it's not a strict structured method that you have to adhere to certain guidelines. It's very flexible. And in that way, it's very useful for planning. Asset mapping has many applications and sub-methodologies. And today I'm going to stick to a very high level overview of what asset mapping is. So it's very much an introduction to the approach. I'm going to discuss some ways that asset mapping might be useful for your work with an overarching goal of just getting you thinking that maybe this is an option to help us move our projects forward. I'm going to cover in our next few minutes together just sort of an overview of what asset mapping is. I'm going to cover some of the considerations about when to use the method and how to use it. We'll talk about some important logistical considerations. I'm going to highlight some of the advantages and disadvantages. And then finally, I'll leave you with some resources and we'll have time for a few questions about what we talk about. Next one. Are you advancing or am I? There we go. So asset mapping is an approach to thinking about community planning. It's a way of thinking about the opportunities or the assets that can be leveraged to strengthen a community or address a specific community issue. In our case, for many of you, that the issue is broadband and digital equity. The approach utilizes a variety of methodologies, so it can be quantitative or using numbers, or it can be qualitative and looking at sort of the nuances and perspectives of many voices. It's commonly planned and implemented through a collaborative group of diverse community members or people or stakeholders. And it uses a systematic or a research-based data collection methodology. So it's very pre-planned and organized. I find this approach can be especially advantageous in situations where equity is a big consideration, as carefully planned asset mapping can elevate unheard community voices and perspectives. And so like one way of collecting that data is through a community forum. that we started with today. You can go to the next slide. All right, so what is an asset? Broadly defined, and this definition comes from the UCL Center for Health Policy Research. But broadly defined, assets include human and physical resources, as well as relationships, services, and even more, as typically defined by an asset mapping steering group. So you bring a group together to say, you know, what do we think the asset classes are around broadband? And you'd start to come through a list. But some of the commonly used ones are listed on this slide. So an asset map can start to analyze the capacities and abilities of community members. It can look at physical infrastructure, such as where is a school, where is a hospital, where is a rec center? And then it can dig deeper into those physical spaces and say, you know, what is the strength of the relationship between these things? So really it's very broad, but assets are things that can improve the quality of life in a community or be a resource that can be leveraged to address a critical issue. Let's go to the next one. Perfect. So the asset-based approach to planning is a departure from a more deficit-oriented approach. It's solution-focused. So if we consider the two maps on this slide, on the left, we see a problem-based map of a neighborhood. So we see all these problems. There's unemployment, there's truancy, there's crime, there's gangs. And so it's sort of, that's the problem. In asset-based community development or in asset mapping approach, you're looking at resources. So the map on the right is really seeking to understand the community resources that could potentially be used to address those problems. So it really lends itself to data use that's going to move a project forward. Increasingly, and I was really surprised as I started pulling these slides together for today, asset mapping is being used a lot around the country for broadband planning and for digital equity efforts. Because broadband technology access involves both people and physical infrastructure, you can start to see sort of the power of using this approach because it can merge together both. You can see on this slide, and I failed to add the source, but we will add that post-presentation. But many communities are looking at assets as physical infrastructure. So you can see on this list, they're trying to map out and document things like, where are their existing networks? Where is their utility infrastructure that could be leveraged to save money for a project, et cetera. So very solidly focused on the infrastructure, the physical assets that exist. That is one way of doing it. I would say, depending on your issue, the group, the steering committee would come together and say, okay, we're going to focus on infrastructure. But I strongly encourage you to bring in more of the human dimensions of things. So on the next slide, I pose a challenge to you, I suppose, or a question. So beyond the physical assets in a community, what other types of assets might be useful when doing broadband planning? And you can just pop a few in the chat, just food for thought. Whole access agreements, community library, libraries. So the places where people are accessing the actual thing, the broadband.
And I would say also, Joss, that libraries also often help people with beyond access. They help people with some of those, technical assistance types of things.
Absolutely. And so that's the kind of thing you can dig into when you do a very serious asset map. You can start with the physical places, but then you can start to pose questions such as who's accessing these places? Who's going to the library? Do they have trust in going there to access the resource? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Questions like that add a whole lot of richness to it's just a library. It tells you much more of a story and can help you understand where there are gaps in services, et cetera, et cetera. So really the possibilities are endless. All right, so on the next, so asset mapping is a participatory method. As I mentioned before, it's really a framing for what encompasses multiple data collection methods. As opposed to that problem-oriented approach, it focuses on resources that can be leveraged. And a major advantage is that it's a systematic way of understanding and hopefully mobilizing community resources to tackle those difficult issues. The graphic here is from a classic foundational text on asset-based community development from Kretzmann and McKnight. And they define 3 purposes or uses of asset mapping. Those include learning more about specific resources, using that data to make program decisions, and mobilizing and empowering those resources. And that happens in a lot of different ways, and we'll see that illustrated in some case studies that I'll dig into in a few. Thinking specifically about asset mapping for broadband planning, there is an organization called digitalinclusion.org that has phenomenal resources. I strongly encourage you to dig into their stuff. They highlight 4 benefits of the asset mapping process as related to digital inclusion. And these include understanding how various assets are connected. So seeing the relationships and strength of relationships between those assets, helping to find gaps in systems. Nothing is more of a complex system than broadband, as far as I can tell. It can help bring in new community partners, and it can generate resources that can be used by the public. So asset mapping data can actually be collected, analyzed, and then put back on a public-facing website or used in a community forum in order to dig deeper. So the whole purpose of asset mapping is for use. The general asset mapping process is actually pretty simple, and there's no real clear checklist. It's going to depend on your needs. But how do you get started with it? What does that overall process look like? Most of them take this approach with the bullets I have outlined. So you start with building a team. I'm assuming many of you already have community teams working on this issue. From there, that team will work together to discuss and develop specific criteria. So they'll identify asset categories. From there, it's about how are we going to gather this information about each asset? Are there existing data sources that we can start with? Do we need to develop an interview protocol? Do we need to organize a community forum and invite some different people? The team will need to think pretty deeply about those logistical considerations if they get into this. And then once that data is collected, there's a step that's more iterative. So the team would start analyzing the data, and then they would identify, hey, we need to know more about X, and maybe go back. And then finally, they visualize the data, and the visualizations that you can do with asset mapping are from the simplest hand-drawn things to very complex geographic information system maps. And I'll show you some examples for those. And then the final step is analyzing, reviewing, and making decisions based on that data. So identifying action steps. All right, let's take a fun look at some different examples of asset maps. Many communities who I've worked with who are just getting started with asset mapping, their main struggle is being able to see what the end product will actually look like. So knowing a few of the possibilities of visualizing or just organizing your data can be helpful for teams getting started. I like to think of it as starting with the end goal in mind. Because if you know what you want to see, then you can structure your data collection accordingly. The map on this slide, this is actually an extension example from Racine Kenosha. And they wanted to understand where the extension office, and we have many programs, they wanted to know which organizations they were working with and the strength of the partnership between those organizations. And they were going to use that for various things like staffing plans, recruitment, et cetera, et cetera. And so essentially what you're looking at here is a network map. And it's a lot of fun to explore. This particular case was very time intensive in terms of individuals filling out a survey about who they work with and how. So that's one consideration that they said, that's a must-have. But at the end of the day, they have this beautiful map that all of our colleagues can explore and sort of understand and get a feel for who Extension is working with. Another example is more familiar to most people, and it's a traditional geographic map. In this example, FoodWise, which is our state SNAP-Ed program, they identified locations that accept food share benefits as an important asset. So that was their asset class. Where can people use their food share benefits? And then they created a database, geocoded the data, and overlaid it onto some of that more problem-focused data, which was where do people live with no high school diploma? And they were using that data in order to make program decisions about, where should we do education? Which partners need support? Who are the highest priority partners, et cetera. People love these geographic maps and they're incredibly useful. And there is a lot of current technology that can make this type of map making more accessible to non-technical audiences. But typically, if you want to have a product like this, it's going to require someone with a pretty good level of GIS or data science to pull it off. And so on the next, the decision about what that end product will look like is really up to the asset mapping planning team that you assemble. And the map, and I use air quotes there, it can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet that lists resources and can help you sort of just get a broad picture of what's happening in a community. Or it can be more complex and relational, like the social network map we saw. You can turn that data into an interactive dashboard that can be very useful for working with multiple partners and coalitions. It can be a geographic map, or it can be question mark, whatever the heck you want it to be, depending on your needs. Let's take a look at a couple more examples quickly. As I mentioned at the beginning, communities across the country are using asset mapping for digital stuff, and broadband included, more and more and more. MissouriBroadband.org has a fantastic interactive website, and it's linked on this slide, so you can explore that after today. But it's really interesting because they're looking geographically, they're looking at infrastructure assets, but they're also adding a little bit of that richness and nuance to what's happening at each specific asset in order to help people make decisions about where to go next. And then a few more examples to ponder on the next slide. Asset maps and data collection processes are going to differ depending on your local resources, your intended use, etc. And they can be anything from sort of an abstract brainstorm of what's happening in community, which you see on the picture on the right. It can be very low tech, super engaging community engagement process where people are drawing connections and having conversation, perhaps in a community forum on the left. That's one of my favorite things to do, especially working with youth. Or it can be very high tech, like the one in the middle, which is Wisconsin DPI's internet access database. It's part of their WISE Dash, and a phenomenal resource. So as you get into this, if you decide, yeah, asset mapping might be a great way for our team to learn more and move things forward, you want to consider, do you want to go low tech, low cost, high tech, higher cost? What are the barriers we have to data collection? And really the core question is, what kind of data and what kind of visualization is going to be most useful for you to move the project forward? All right. This is a whole hour-long topic in and of itself, advantages and disadvantages. I pulled out a few that come to mind for me when I'm thinking about, is asset mapping a good fit for my planning process? The advantages of it are, it's inclusive. It's when done right, can really elevate the voices of a lot of different people. So you're getting different perspectives on what assets are, because an asset for me may be a deficit for Jessica, for all we know. You got to talk to people and you got to gather the data and see. The process definitely can build capacity, strengthen networks, mobilize resources, and is oriented towards use. The disadvantages, it can be time intensive depending on the level that you want to get in. It can be resource intensive, and in particular, having someone that can organize and merge both qualitative and quantitative data. And it can also be planning intensive. So just some things to consider as you start to get into things. And then I wanted to share a few of my favorite go-to guidebooks and resources, and 3 are highlighted here. My absolute favorite is the classic on the left. The one in the middle is a good resource because it outlines checklists and key steps in the process. And then the third one is very in-depth, and it's more health focused, but I'm sure you can see how you could change the keyword, the key problem of health into an asset map around digital equity or broadband. And then there are more and more resources out there for asset mapping that's broadband specific. This list here, they're all hyperlinked. And this one in particular, which is from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, is very good, especially in terms of helping you think about who do you invite to participate in an interview about a particular asset, or what are some ideas for visualizing, or what are some ideas for asset classes related to the physical assets. It's very comprehensive and accessible, at least in my opinion. Okay. And so then, just to recap, asset mapping is a process that uses collaborative and a participatory process to define asset classes, collect data about those assets in a systematic way, visualize the data, analyze the data, and use it to make program decisions. It's solution-oriented and can help tackle really complex issues. It's not always the best fit for everyone. So if you're excited about it, awesome. If it's in the back of your head and it might not be a good fit right now, that's also great. But I would argue that issues such as broadband, in which digital equity is an important and a really key component, those kind of efforts can really benefit from this approach when it combines that human perspective with the physical and infrastructure-based asset classes. So by doing so, you're bringing in new perspectives and resources that can benefit the overall effort. As you consider it, or if you consider it, I would think about these key questions. One, do you have a team with the capacity to do it well? Two, really think hard about who should be included on your team. How will you define assets? So do your background research. Take the time to explore what existing data sources are out there. There is so much these days. You don't need to reinvent the wheel sometimes. You can start with what exists and say, here's what else we need to know on top of that existing data, and use an asset map approach to do that. And then finally, really check to make sure you have the technical expertise to gather, organize, and visualize that data. And so with that, I will open it up for questions.
And Jassa, quickly, I would just add that, the technical expertise, perhaps in your county, you have an extension educator there that you might be able to connect with, who, they may or may not be able to meet all of your needs, but that's a good place to start.
Right. Well, thank you, Jessica and Josset. And before we move on to the questions, I want to thank all of you for participating in our webinar today. We will be posting the recording and PowerPoint from today's session as soon as we have it available. I welcome all of you to stay online for the next approximately 15 to 17 minutes, where we will open the floor for any questions you may have for Jessica and Josset or me, or just whoever. We also have representatives from the Public Service Commission, which is the Wisconsin Broadband office online, I see. So that you have in general about broadband or broadband planning. We will start with questions from the chat. It's where I'm going to try to take them from the chat first. And since we've a little bit of a condensed time frame here, also, if you prefer to unmute your mic and ask a question, please do that as well. So, all right, so thank you. I think you guys did that well. There aren't any questions yet here, but we'll give it a minute. There usually are, but
I'll work on getting those links in the chat right now.
if not, any questions, or in the interim, let me remind you, if you will, that our first upcoming in-person broadband workshop, 2-day workshop, is to be held September 6th to 7th. So next, Wednesday and Thursday in Rice Lake at Northwoods Technical College. And that is the first of 4. And the one in Rice Lake is primarily to serve the Northwest region of Wisconsin. The second one will be the 28th and 29th in Toma at, Jessica, I think, Cranberry Country Lodge, if I have that correctly. And then we have, is that right?
Yes,
and
it is.
And then Fond du Lac, and I can't remember the location, Fond du Lac on October 9th and 10th. And then Rhinelander, much closer to where I am, but Rhinelander on October 25th and 26th at Nicolay College. So, and I think there's something from Marianne. Marianne, good to see you online, well, so to speak, online. A question for the PSC about the Federal Communications Commission EAP program. That's the, do you know what ISPs in Wisconsin are eligible for this program? If anybody, I don't know if Alyssa is on or they can. By any chance?
Not for this one.
Yeah, not for, okay. About the, yeah, remind me what the initials, the EAP, Marianne, off the top of our.
Yeah, what the EAP is the enhanced ACAM program.
Oh, the ACAM, okay.
Yeah, there was ACAM 1, and now the ESP has opened opportunities for providers to sign on to ACAM 2. And my understanding is if a provider's, and they have until the end of September to make this determination. But my understanding is that if a provider accepts participation in the ACAM program, that then that geography is no longer eligible for either the ARPA capital projects funding or BEAD funding.
A federal technicality, and so I don't know the answer to, but I see if you know Josie, and I think you might, Marianne, she's answered that. Not sure if Alyssa is on, which she obviously isn't today, but we can get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you, Josie.
Oh, Matt, go ahead, Matt. If you know, please chime in. So,
yeah, sorry, I was having some technical difficulties here. Yeah, that's correct. So I think it's by October 1st, they have to commit to whether or not they're going to accept the enhanced ACAM offer, and they will be BEAD ineligible or CPF ineligible if indeed they're going to provide at least 100 by 20 megabit service. So if that's the case, then they would be ineligible for BEAD funding or CPF funding.
Correct. I'm just wondering if the PSC has any intel on who all in Wisconsin is eligible for this. I mean, I know of at least one ISP that's eligible, but I don't know of any others.
Yeah, I think I'd have to talk with Alyssa to confirm, but we don't have any solid intel on who is eligible or planning to accept the offer as of yet. But we can definitely circle back.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Are there others? And by the way, thank you, Cliff. For community forums will lead to efficiency, productivity, and cost controls across multiple platforms. And I'm just going to conclude us here. I apologize for the noise in the background, but I'm in a multi-tenant facility, and so that the reality of that there. So, but thanks for joining us today. I want to remind you that the first of our upcoming in-person broadband workshops is, as I did, to be held 6th to 7th of September in Rice Lake at Northwoods Technical College. And if there are no questions or no further discussion, we can end for today. But thank you for joining. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. I'll stop recording, but we'll stay on for just a little bit in case you had a lingering question.